The Oasis Prime in Chicago was less a supermarket and more a temple to commerce, a monument built by its founder, Warren Sterling. Its aisles were wide and polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cool, designer LED lights that hung like modern constellations from the high ceiling. Every product, from organic kale to imported cheese, was arranged with a kind of military precision, a silent testament to an obsession with order. The city's wealthiest residents glided through this sterile perfection, their state-of-the-art shopping carts moving with an eerie silence. The air itself felt curated, filtered and chilled, carrying the faint, clean scent of money and efficiency. It was a world of flawless surfaces and calculated transactions, a place meticulously designed to keep the messiness of human life safely outside its automatic glass doors. In this cathedral of consumption, any display of raw, unscripted emotion was a jarring anomaly. Warren Sterling moved through his creation like a ghost in a machine he had built himself. At 52, he wore a bespoke suit that cost more than the cars most people drove, a grey armor against a world he preferred to observe rather than inhabit. His posture was rigid, his expression a carefully maintained mask of control, and his eyes were the eyes of a hawk, constantly scanning for imperfections, for misaligned cans or smudges on the glass. He wasn't shopping, he was auditing reality. This empire, this multi-billion-dollar chain, was his life's work, a fortress of success built over the ruins of a past trauma he refused to acknowledge. He was a master of logistics and profit margins, yet profoundly inept at human connection, a lonely king ruling over a sterile, emotional desert of his own making. His impersonal inspection brought him past the long line of checkout counters, each one a model of swift, frictionless service. But then his gaze, trained to spot operational flaws, snagged on something profoundly out of place. It was a single, glistening tear, tracing a slow path down the cheek of a young checkout operator named Clara. She continued her work with a practiced professionalism, her hands scanning items, her voice politely reciting the total. But her pain was a palpable disruption in the store's cold harmony. The woman's face was etched with a weariness that her uniform couldn't hide, and her eyes, though gentle, held a deep, quiet desperation. For a man who measured everything, this unquantifiable drop of human sorrow was the only thing in the entire store that truly caught his attention. Warren waited, an unfamiliar impulse stirring beneath his corporate programming. As the customer departed, leaving a small, silent space between transactions, he broke a lifelong protocol. He stepped forward, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished floor, and approached her station. The ambient hum of refrigerators and distant chatter seemed to fade as he leaned in slightly. "Miss, is everything all right?" The question, simple and direct, was the key that unlocked a dam of carefully contained grief. Clara's composure shattered. In a choked, trembling voice that was barely a whisper, she revealed the unbearable truth. Her daughter was in the hospital, and her latest paycheck had been cut short by several $100s, the exact amount she needed for the copay on a prescription that was keeping her little girl alive. The words hung in the air, an indictment of the perfect system he had built. The calculated hum of the Oasis Prime faded into a dull roar in Warren's ears. He saw not a checkout clerk, but a ghost from his own past, a time when a few $100s was the impassable mountain between life and death. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, built brick by brick with profit margins and market shares, began to crumble. He felt the cold draft of a memory he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. Without a word, he gestured for her to follow him, leading her away from the polished checkout lane and toward the stark, windowless manager's office in the back. The space was as impersonal as he was, furnished with a sterile metal desk and a single uncomfortable chair, a place for directives, not confessions. Inside, with the heavy door clicked shut, the silence was absolute. Clara stood awkwardly, her hands clasped in front of her, her body trembling almost imperceptibly. She seemed to be bracing for the inevitable, a reprimand, a dismissal, a final, crushing blow to her already fragile world. Warren, however, didn't sit behind the desk to establish authority. Instead, he leaned against it, his posture losing some of its rigid control for the first time. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual corporate edge. "Start with your daughter. What's her name?" The simple, personal question was an offering of humanity, and it gave her the courage to speak. "Her name was Sophie," she whispered, "and she was 6 years old." As Clara spoke, her voice gaining a quiet strength, Warren's mind drifted back decades to a cramped, dimly lit apartment that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. He remembered the face of his younger sister, pale and feverish, her breathing shallow. He remembered the frantic, whispered arguments between his parents over a medical bill they couldn't possibly pay. He had been a teenager then, powerless, watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, a life slipping away not because of a lack of love, but a lack of money. He had sworn on that day that he would build a fortress of wealth so high that such a thing could never touch his family again. Yet here he was, in his fortress, and the same quiet desperation had found its way inside. He snapped back to the present, his jaw tight with a renewed, ancient anger. This wasn't just about a clerical error. It was a moral failure. It was a cancer in the heart of the empire he had built to prevent this very kind of suffering. He looked at Clara, at the raw honesty in her tired eyes, and made a decision that went against every rule in his corporate playbook. He wouldn't just cut her a check. That was the old Warren solution, a sterile transaction to make a problem disappear. Instead, he would give her something far more valuable, his trust. "This is a systemic issue," he stated, his voice now firm with purpose. "And I need your help to fix it. I need you to be my eyes and ears. I trust you." The words hung in the air, so unexpected that Clara wasn't sure if she had heard them correctly. Trust. It was a currency she hadn't dealt in for a very long time. Her manager, Greg Henderson, had taught her that trust was a liability, that her concerns were complaints, and that her vulnerability was a weakness to be exploited. For months, he had been a master of gaslighting, making her doubt her own records, her own memory, all while projecting an image of a supportive, charismatic leader to his superiors. This offer from the company's founder felt like a lifeline thrown into a raging sea, but she was terrified to grab it. What if it was just another trick? What if this powerful, distant man was simply testing her loyalty before casting her aside? Her hesitation was palpable, a silent battle between years of conditioned fear and a desperate flicker of hope. She thought of Sophie, of the beeping machines and the too large hospital gown, and the choice became clear. She had nothing left to lose. She met Warren's gaze, and for the first time, he saw the steel beneath her weariness. She told him about Greg, about the small, consistent discrepancies in her paychecks and those of a few other quiet employees. She spoke of his charm that could turn to ice in a private conversation, the subtle threats veiled as friendly advice, and the way he made everyone feel indebted to him for their jobs. It's in moments like these, when you see a good person cornered by a system designed to crush them, that you realize how many stories like this go untold. And if you believe these stories need a voice, subscribing helps us continue to give them one. Warren listened without interruption, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He gave Clara his personal cell number and a small, discreet recording device, no bigger than a shirt button. The instructions were simple. Act as if their conversation had never happened, but document everything. Every conversation with Greg, every discrepancy, every instance of another employee expressing fear or concern. He assured her that her job was safe, that he would be her silent partner in this. As Clara left the office and walked back to her post, the weight of the tiny device in her pocket felt immense. It was both a weapon and a terrifying burden, a symbol of a dangerous alliance that could either save her or destroy what little she had left. Later that evening, the fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway cast long, sterile shadows on the linoleum floor. Clara sat by Sophie's bed, holding her small, warm hand. Wires and tubes connected her daughter to a symphony of quiet beeps and gentle hisses, the soundtrack of their lives for the past several months. Sophie was asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her mother. Looking at her daughter, Clara felt her resolve solidify. This wasn't just about her paycheck anymore. It was about fighting for the person who was her entire world. It was about refusing to let her daughter's future be decided by a petty thief in a manager's uniform. She would do what Warren asked, not just for him, but for Sophie. The next few days at the Oasis Prime were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Greg Henderson, sensing a shift he couldn't quite identify, doubled down on his campaign of intimidation. He began publicly scrutinizing Clara's work, timing her transactions with a stopwatch and making pointed comments about her speed in front of customers. He assigned her the most difficult shifts, changed her schedule without notice, and spread subtle rumors among the staff that she was being investigated for theft. Her co-workers, who had once offered quiet words of sympathy, now avoided her gaze, their fear of Greg outweighing their loyalty to her. She was an island, isolated and exposed. The pressure mounting with every hour. Warren, meanwhile, was fighting his own internal battle. His every instinct screamed at him to descend upon the Chicago store, to fire Greg on the spot, to solve the problem with the swift, brutal efficiency he was known for. But he knew that would only solve the surface issue. It wouldn't expose the rot that had allowed a man like Greg to thrive. It wouldn't help the other employees who were too scared to speak up. He had to learn to operate differently, to move with patience and precision, to trust in the process and in the courage of a checkout operator he had met only days before. He was changing, and that process was painful but necessary. It's a journey many of us face, learning to become better versions of ourselves. We're so grateful you're here to witness this one, and every time you subscribe, you ensure more journeys of hope can be shared. The breakthrough came a week later. A former employee, a young man who had been fired by Greg 3 months prior for poor performance, reached out to Clara after hearing through the grapevine that someone was finally standing up to the manager. He had kept meticulous records of his own doctored timesheets, digital proof of Greg's systematic wage theft. He'd been too afraid to go to HR, certain that the charismatic manager would turn the tables on him. He forwarded the evidence to Clara, who immediately sent it to Warren. It was the first piece of concrete, undeniable proof, a crack in the dam of lies that Greg had so carefully constructed. Just as this small victory emerged, Clara received a frantic call from the hospital. Sophie had developed a complication, an infection that her weakened immune system was struggling to fight. The doctors needed to start a new, even more expensive round of treatments immediately, and the copay was astronomical. The news hit Clara like a physical blow, sucking the air from her lungs. The professional crisis and her personal nightmare had just converged into a single, terrifying point. The clock was no longer just ticking on Greg's scheme, it was ticking on her daughter's life. The quiet investigation had just become a desperate race against time. The call from the hospital had been the final catalyst. Armed with Clara's recordings and the digital evidence from the former employee, Warren Sterling moved with a speed and decisiveness that had built his empire. He called an emergency meeting in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the store floor. Greg Henderson arrived first, radiating a confident charm that he wore like a well-tailored suit. He greeted the 2 regional directors with handshakes and easy smiles, completely unaware that he was walking into his own corporate execution. Clara was asked to wait just outside. her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When Warren entered, the room fell silent. He carried no briefcase, no laptop, only a thin manila folder. He didn't take a seat at the head of the table. Instead, he stood, his presence dominating the sterile space, his eyes cold and clear as polished steel. He began without preamble, his voice a low, controlled monotone that cut through the nervous energy in the room. He outlined a series of payroll anomalies that had been flagged at their flagship store, framing it as a routine but serious audit. Greg immediately went on the offensive, launching into a smooth, practiced monologue about the pressures of managing a high-volume location and the unfortunate necessity of performance-based hour adjustments. He then pivoted, his expression shifting to one of paternalistic concern. He mentioned Clara by name, describing her as a dedicated but deeply troubled employee, overwhelmed by personal issues. He suggested her confusion over her pay was a cry for help, a tragic symptom of stress, expertly painting himself as the compassionate leader trying to manage a delicate situation. The regional directors nodded, their faces reflecting sympathy for Greg's managerial burden. Warren allowed the lie to settle in the air before he slowly opened the manila folder. From it, he produced not a spreadsheet, but the tiny button recorder, placing it gently in the center of the gleaming mahogany table. He pressed play. Greg's voice filled the room, not the smooth, charming tone he had just used, but a voice laced with venom, telling another young employee that if he ever questioned his timesheet again, he'd find himself blacklisted from every retail job in Chicago. The color drained from Greg's face, his confident smirk collapsing into a mask of pure panic. He stammered, calling the recording a violation, a fabrication, then turned his rage on the woman he knew was responsible. "It's her!" he spat, pointing a trembling finger toward the glass door. "That woman is a thief and a liar, trying to extort this company because she can't manage her own life." Ignoring the outburst completely, Warren's gaze locked onto Greg, and for the first time, a deep, raw emotion broke through his controlled facade. "This was never about the money," he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that was decades old. "I built this company from nothing because I watched a member of my own family die. We couldn't afford the medicine. We couldn't afford the copay. I swore I would build a fortress so high that no one under my protection would ever feel that kind of desperate, crushing helplessness." He paused, his eyes moving from the defeated manager to the regional director's Bishki, and finally he looked through the glass at Clara. "You didn't just steal wages, Mr. Henderson. You stole dignity. You stole hope. That is a theft for which there is no restitution." The confession hung in the silent room, fundamentally reframing the man they thought they knew. The ruthless tycoon was gone, replaced by a person driven by a profound and painful purpose. Greg stood frozen, exposed and utterly defeated. Warren's voice returned to its sharp, executive clip. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." Without another glance at the disgraced manager, he walked to the door and opened it for Clara. He looked directly into her tired but steady eyes, and in front of the stunned directors, his voice softened. "Clara," he said, the name a promise. "On behalf of Oasis Prime, and from me personally, I'm deeply sorry. You were failed. It was a systemic failure, and I'm going to need your help to ensure it never happens again." It was more than an apology. It was the sound of a king finally healing his own broken kingdom. The changes that followed were not gradual, they were seismic, a fundamental restructuring of a world built on cold efficiency. Warren Sterling didn't just cover Sophie's medical bills. He established a direct lifetime fund for her care, an institutional apology for an institutional failure. Then, in a move that sent shockwaves through the corporate office, he promoted Clara to Vice President of Operations. She wasn't given the title as a gift, but as a mandate. Her first task, he explained, was not to learn the business of Oasis Prime, but to teach it humanity. She was to dismantle the systems that allowed men like Greg Henderson to flourish and replace them with policies built on transparency, dignity, and support. Standing in the same stark office where she had once trembled with fear, Clara accepted, not with tears of gratitude, but with the quiet, steely resolve of a survivor who had just been handed the tools to rebuild a better world for everyone. Clara's leadership was a quiet revolution. She began not in the boardroom, but on the floors of the stores, speaking with cashiers, stockers, and janitors. She implemented an entirely new, fully transparent payroll system and created an anonymous employee support hotline managed by an independent third party. She didn't just change policies, she changed the culture. Meanwhile, Warren underwent his own profound transformation. He started to see his employees not as assets on a balance sheet, but as people with stories as vital as his own. He began a slow, difficult reconciliation with his estranged son, finally sharing the story of the sister he had lost, the trauma that had driven him to build an empire but had cost him his family. The fortress of wealth he had constructed finally had a heart, and its beat was growing stronger every day. 3 years later, the grand hall of a downtown Chicago hotel was filled with the employees of Oasis Prime, from executives to checkout clerks. On a brightly lit stage stood Clara, no longer looking weary, but radiating a calm, powerful confidence. Beside her, holding her hand, was Sophie, a healthy, smiling 9-year-old with bright, curious eyes. They were there to launch the Sophie's Light Foundation, a healthcare fund sponsored by the company, dedicated to covering all medical costs for the children of every single employee. Clara spoke of a company that was more than a business, but a community that took care of its own, ensuring that no parent would ever again have to face the impossible choice she once did. It was a promise made real, a testament to how one person's integrity could illuminate the darkest corners of a broken system. From a seat in the back row, a semi-retired Warren Sterling watched, his once impassive face softened by a genuine, peaceful smile. He was no longer the lonely king of a sterile empire, but a cherished member of a family he had unintentionally created. A beloved grandfather figure to the little girl who had saved him as much as he had saved her. He had learned that the real bottom line wasn't measured in profit margins or stock prices, but in the quiet dignity of a well-cared-for life, in the hope restored in a mother's eyes, and in the bright, healthy future of a child. It's a powerful truth that reminds us how much good can come from a single moment of connection. We are so thankful you have witnessed this story with us, and by subscribing, you help us continue to share these essential reminders of our shared humanity.